Hey, welcome to the Healthful Woman podcast, the fastest growing podcast in women's health. Today's Monday, January 15th, 2024. On today's podcast, Stephanie Ezcurra Williams joins me to tell the birth story of her son, Gus, which involves getting preeclampsia in the middle of Mardi Gras last year. Now, Mardi Gras 2024 is just around the corner, which means we also want to wish a happy first birthday to little Gus, which he will be celebrating along with Stephanie and Matthew next month. Thanks to Stephanie for volunteering to tell your story. It's a great one. All right. Reminder for anyone listening on Apple or Spotify, it would be awesome if you could rate this podcast, preferably with 5 stars. Please do leave comments. I read all of them. Also, please email us any questions you might have for our mailbag podcast. You can either email us directly at hw@healthfulwoman.com, or you can go to our website, www.healthfulwoman.com, and click on the link that says send us your questions. Remember, these questions are for mailbag podcasts only, not for personal medical advice that you need answered. If you actually have medical advice and questions that you need answered, please ask your own doctor. I don't answer these questions quickly. It's going to be a month or two, and it's going to be on a podcast and not necessarily unique to you. All right, finally, if you want to pre-order the book, it's coming just around the corner that Emily and Oster and I wrote, The Unexpected. It is going to be published and available sometime in April, I believe. So if you want to pre-order it, you can do that on our website. And when I have more information on book signings and events and things like that, I will absolutely pass them along. Thank you all for listening. See everybody next week.
Welcome to today's episode of Healthful Woman, a podcast designed to explore topics in women's health at all stages of life. I'm your host, Dr. Nathan Fox, an OBGYN and maternal fetal medicine specialist practicing in New York City. At Healthful Woman, I speak with leaders in the field to help you learn more about women's health, pregnancy, and wellness. All right, Stephanie, welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
Thank you. I am doing great. It's a cold day here in Tampa, but all is well. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to hear it's cold in Tampa. What does that mean to you degrees-wise?
Yeah, you're probably going to laugh. It's about 45 degrees today, which is, substantially cold for Florida.
Fair.
But compared to New York and, anywhere else on the East Coast, Midwest, it is not.
Yeah,
cold.
I went running this morning in Central Park and it was 25 degrees and it was it's pretty cold. I mean, we get colder, but that's sort of the breaking point of like cold to really cold. So, all right, I'm sorry. I'm sorry it's so chilly out in Tampa. So, excellent.
Thank you. We're getting by.
That's terrific. So you are a toaster.
Yes.
Now,
I am a toaster. Yes.
For our listeners who have not been paying attention over the past several months, can you explain what that means?
Yes. So a toaster is a listener of the podcast, The Toast, which is hosted by Jackie and Claudia Oshry. The reason this is relevant to the Healthful Woman podcast is because Dr. Fox was Jackie's OBGYN and MSM in New York. So, there was a lot of talk about the famous Dr. Fox from The Toast, from Jackie, and that is how a lot of toasters, which is what we call ourselves, have recently been connected to you and the podcast.
And is that how you found this podcast?
That is, yeah. So I got really interested in Jackie's birth story, not only her second, which involved you a lot, but also her first. And you were a little bit involved with her first pregnancy. So I had heard about you just from her talking about it on the Toast podcast. And, obviously her second pregnancy came around and you were heavily involved. You were a main character in the story. So Dr. Fox came up again and, she was on your podcast. You were on the Patreon. I heard you on the Patreon and I was like, I really loved your presence and your demeanor. And so I started listening to the Healthful Woman podcast after that Patreon episode aired.
Well, welcome aboard. We're loving the toasters that have hopped on the Healthful Woman train, and it's awesome. And have you been weighing in on the debate of the name of this podcast, or are you staying out of that disagreement?
I was telling my husband last night about what does the fox say, and he thought it was hysterical. So I like the name of the podcast. It is a bit of a mouthful, but you have good mentorship with Jackie. If she's going to she's the queen of nicknames, the queen of just, naming people, doing the whole thing. I don't know if you've heard the nicknames she has for her siblings, but they are quite all over the place. I know Claudia goes by Turdy. So she's a really great person to ask about a good name. I think that she could help come up with one for sure.
That is, well, we can use all the help we can get. That's for sure. And we're open to free advice. So that is great. Well, what prompted you to volunteer to tell your story on the podcast? Because it's one thing to tune in and listen, and sort of sit on the sidelines, but it's another thing to jump in the pool.
Yeah. So there are a few things about my story that I thought would be interesting to share. The first is that when I started listening to the Healthful Woman podcast, I was searching just endlessly for preeclampsia stories. And also just, I know that you have a lot of specialists on your show and a lot of other doctors that come on and talk. And I just couldn't get enough of the preeclampsia and HELP syndrome episodes. And I just feel like there could be more to talk about them. So I wanted to share my story. I also have an interesting element to my story because my story took place in New Orleans in the heart of Mardi Gras season. So there's kind of a bit of an interesting dynamic there just with Mardi Gras being in full swing. And I don't know if you've been to New Orleans during Mardi Gras, but it is quite the event. So a lot of my story takes place just in the heart of that season. And kind of how that affected my birth story is just a little interesting. I also am somebody who has never had any kind of health issues in the past. I've been very fortunate to have good health. My blood tests are always great. My lab results are always great. And to be kind of faced with this traumatic experience with preeclampsia and just also a traumatic birth experience, related but a little bit unrelated to preeclampsia, I just thought it was a good platform to share with other people who think, I'm in good health. I don't have to worry about this stuff. Everything goes according to plan. I've never been hospitalized. I've never done any of these things. And it's important to know that, pregnancy, it's a different ballgame. And even if you're in great health, if you exercise, if you eat well, you can still have unexpected health outcomes. So I just thought it would be a great platform to share that story on.
Terrific. Well, you've come to the right place. I do agree. This is one of the platforms to do that. I agree that no matter how many podcasts we can have from the medical side talking about, let's say, preeclampsia or HELP syndrome or any condition, really, there is tremendous value from hearing the same story from your side, from the person going through it, her side.
Yeah.
Because again, there is obviously overlap because we'll talk about some of the medicine in this, but just what is the experience of it? What's it like? And I think that that's something that frequently gets missed in a lot of these topics. And it's not just relevant, but it's highly important to understand it. To answer your question about Mardi Gras, I have been to New Orleans. I have not yet been to New Orleans for Mardi Gras, but interestingly, my sister, when she was a senior in high school, she told my parents that she and her friend were going around the Midwest, because we lived in Chicago, to visit colleges so she can make an informed decision about colleges. But instead, they drove my parents' minivan all the way down to New Orleans and spent a week in Mardi Gras, which was, first of all, God bless her. This was awesome. She was legendary for this. And she came back and didn't want anyone to find out, but she told everyone about it. So of course I found out, but my parents didn't find out for 40 years or 30 years. It was we were retelling this story and my parents wait, you went to Mardi Gras? What? I was uh-oh. But we were adults by then, but it was cool. So yeah, so that's my experience with Mardi Gras. So it's a good story, but I wasn't personally, I was a good student. I was a rule follower. My sister, not so much. So
yeah, your sister's bold.
Yes,
wow.
Very, but I digress. All right. So we're going to be talking about the birth story for your son, Gus, who is coming up on a year, right?
Yes, it'll be, he's 9 months now, so he'll be a year in February.
Amazing. All right. So listen, take us to the story. So if he was born in February 23, I guess we can start the story in 22. You're coming into pregnancy. Tell me about Stephanie Ezcurra Williams in 2022. Who are you? Where you're living? What's your story? What's going on?
Yeah, so I'll take you a little bit earlier than that, just to give some context for people who are listening. But I am originally from California, if you can't tell from my somewhat Valley Girl accent. I'm from California, born and raised. I moved in 2016. I went to college in the South and then moved in 2016 to Memphis, where I worked for FedEx corporate. And my husband at the time was an M3 at the University of Tennessee. So he was a third-year medical student. We met in a very traditional way called Tinder. Very, just a beautiful love story. We met on an app and kind of had we just quickly connected. And in 2018, we got engaged and we moved to New Orleans for him to start his residency in urology. So he is a urologist, not to be confused with neurology. So I always tell people,
very different parts of the body.
Very different. Yeah. I always my joke is, no, it's the other brain. That's my kind of go-to joke. But yeah, the other brain, the male brain, urology. So we moved to New Orleans and I got a job working at the healthcare system that he was a resident at. So I worked in HR for them. So I was on the corporate side. He was a resident. And we were meant to get married in 2020, April of 2020. And obviously that did not happen with COVID. So we pushed the wedding back to March of 2021. We still relatively normal wedding. That's a whole other story because we had to replan it 4 times and switch venues the month before. It was kind of crazy. We still had COVID protocols in place. We gave everyone masks. So a little bit of a different wedding than, what we expected. But we did get married in 2021. And after about a year of marriage, we had thought, once he was a chief resident or going into chief residency, which is your last year of residency, that we would try to start a family. We had always agreed that we wanted to have children, and kind of the question was when, and we just felt like we were financially in a good spot. And just with his schedule, being his last year as a resident, it was a good time. So I stopped taking my birth control in March of 2022. And I didn't expect to get pregnant so quickly. I have a lot of friends who struggle with fertility. So I was under the impression that it would, take a while. And I got pregnant within 2 months.
Strong work.
Yes. So, it worked. It was great, but it was extremely unexpected because I was not expecting it to happen that quickly, which is, of course, a blessing, and I'm thankful for it. But we were a little, unprepared in that sense because I don't even think at that point my cycle had regulated. So what's kind of interesting is that in June of 2022, I went to my annual OBGYN checkup just for, the pap smear, the whole fun part of going to the OBGYN. Mm-hmm. And I had mentioned to her that I had gotten off of birth control, that, we were trying to get pregnant. We weren't tracking or anything like that. And she had mentioned, do you want to maybe get some blood work done just to kind of see where your levels are? And, being married to someone in medicine, working adjacently in medicine, not clinically, but working in a medical field. And I'm always open to learning more about my body. So I said, absolutely. And so we did the blood test and everything had come back normal. My AMH levels were pretty low and she didn't seem to have any concerns about it, but I was a little concerned. And she was like, don't worry about it. You're fine. You're fine. And I was like, okay. What's funny though about that appointment is that I actually was pregnant at that appointment, but did not know.
Right. I was going to ask, did they send an HCG level?
No.
Okay.
And
that would have diagnosed
which is
it.
not unusual,
No,
right?
no.
Because I was only 2 weeks in. And so there was really no reason for her to do any kind of urine sample. I probably wouldn't have showed up on a urine test. And she didn't think that I was pregnant, and neither did I. So, it wasn't ordered.
Right.
So it's just a little funny that I went through all this blood work to see how my fertility was. And I actually was pregnant at that time.
Beautiful. You're cured.
Yeah, literally. So on the 4th of July, I remember it was the 4th of July. I didn't know yet at this point that I was pregnant, but we were just doing 4th of July festivities, making the hot dogs. I think I was drinking a beer at this time, and something just said, you should take a pregnancy test. And I did, and I was pregnant. And I was like, oh, well, I'm going to put my beer down. It's probably a good time to put that away. And yeah, so it was the 4th of July that we found out. And, it was really exciting news. So we were
It's
very
amazing.
happy about it.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. And how did your pregnancy go?
So up until the end, my pregnancy was, I think, very textbook and standard. I didn't have any kind of medical concerns. I had the nausea and the morning sickness and the fatigue, but nothing that was a concern. My blood tests for, genetics and whatnot were all normal. I didn't have any abnormal anatomy scans or ultrasounds. So everything was pretty, going according to plan. There didn't seem to be any concerns. I wasn't high risk or anything like that.
Is it the fact that you were married to a doctor, a resident, did that have any impact at all on your pregnancy? Sometimes, they know a lot more, or sometimes they're more anxious or less anxious, or you are, did that have any relevance to your prenatal care, or just he was just sort of coming along like dads?
Yeah. So I do think towards the end of my pregnancy, it did. And I'll get into that a little bit. But sometimes when you're married to somebody in medicine, and your wife may be able to attest to this, but sometimes other medical providers kind of talk to you differently than if you weren't in medicine. Sometimes I feel like, maybe the risks, benefits, and alternatives of care are glanced over and not as thorough when you're married to somebody in medicine.
Oh, you mean like the doctor or midwife, whoever, when they're talking to you, they just assume you guys know more than you do, or
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
no, that's a reality. We try very hard not to do that. I always say, like, some of you may know some of this, but I'm starting from the beginning just, to catch everyone up. But yeah, that can definitely happen. Unfortunately, it's not supposed to happen, but it can.
Yeah, I mean, doctors are only human, and so I can understand why that happens. But I do feel like it impacted my care in the sense where there's a lot of information that seemed to be assumed that I understood that I didn't actually understand. For example, at the beginning of my pregnancy, I was given a blood pressure cuff, and I didn't know why. No one really explained to me
like a gift.
Why. Yeah, I thought it was just something free.
Hey,
like, it's free.
Here's a pen, a t-shirt, and a blood pressure cuff.
Yeah. And they gave me a scale too. The scale, I understood that one. I was like, okay, yeah. So, you want to make sure you're gaining weight and how much you're gaining and whatnot. But the blood pressure cuff, I was not well informed on why I needed to, the importance of it, why I needed to take my blood pressure. For someone who's never had blood pressure concerns in the past, it just didn't really it just wasn't well explained to me on why I needed it. And so
it's interesting because it's not typical that people would be given a blood pressure cuff to take their blood pressure at home unless they had an increased risk, or unless maybe, were they doing, it's 22, were they doing reduced visits because of COVID or something at that time still? Or was
so they were doing reduced visits, but it wasn't because of COVID. So essentially what they had told me was that if I did keep on top of my weight and my blood pressure, that I would be able to come to less in-person visits and do more virtual visits.
I see.
It seemed like it was just kind of a way for them to do some of their vital work without us actually having to come in. It was through the tech side of the health organization. So it wasn't due to COVID, but every single patient that was a patient there at that hospital received this.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I'm not opposed to it. I'm just saying it's not sort of standard that everyone is told to check their blood pressure every X amount of time at home, unless there's a high risk, so to speak, reason to. But there's definitely logic behind it. Like, hey, if all we're really doing is, checking your blood pressure and weight and maybe speaking a little bit, you could probably do that at home and we can speak on the phone or whatever. So I get it, but that is interesting that you actually had a blood pressure cuff at home. Okay. So you had it at home as your parting gift, or, whatever, welcome to practice gift.
Yeah.
Didn't quite know why. All right.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So then what happened as you got towards the end of pregnancy?
Yeah. So I'll add a little bit of the Mardi Gras element because it is an important part of the story.
You didn't run into my sister there, correct? As far as you know?
I did not. No. As far as I'm concerned.
All right. Got it.
People have a lot of alter egos during Mardi Gras, so I can't say for certain. But, New Orleans is a great city. It has a lot of character and charm. I mean, it has its problems, just like any city, but Mardi Gras is, the season of the year. It is 2 weeks long. And the year before, in 2021, or I guess this would have been 2022 because it's February of 2022, I was in the crew of Cleopatra, which is an all-female crew. And for those who don't know, what it means to be in a crew is that you ride on a float, you throw beads, and each crew has their own set number of floats, let's say like 30 floats. And these are huge, New Orleans, decorated Mardi Gras floats. And it's a really big honor to be in a crew. It's kind of like a social club in a way that happens just once a year. And so when I found out that I was pregnant and would be delivering in March, which was, my due date, I unfortunately decided that I probably couldn't ride for the year of 2023, which, at first I actually thought that I would do it. I was really motivated to ride in the float, but my friends talked some sense into me and they're like, you cannot be 8 months pregnant doing this. That's probably not a great idea.
What was the concern, that you had to stand for so long, or that there's
a few things. The standing for a long time is one, but also if there was any sort of medical emergency, it'd be really hard to get medical care because all the roads shut down. The floats drive on the actual, paved roads that cars drive down. So it's really hard to get medical care at Mardi Gras with road blockages. There's thousands of people there. So I wasn't so much concerned about the standing. I was more concerned about
what if
there was medical emergency, I wouldn't be able to get care that I need.
Okay, fair.
Yeah. Yes. So that was really why, but I still wanted to be a part of the festivities. So on February 8th, I went with friends to help load up the float, which just means they were the ones riding. And what you do is you take your beads out and you organize them on the float before you actually ride. The reason you do that is because during the actual event, you don't want to be opening bags of beads and organizing them and throwing them. You want it nicely organized in advance. So you do it a few days in advance of the actual parade. So I went on the 8th, and I had for the few days before that been dealing with some pretty bad swelling, but this being my first pregnancy, I did not know that it was abnormal. I just thought, it's end of pregnancy things. You get swollen and you're achy and your feet are numb. And these are all things that happen when you're pregnant. I didn't know it was anything of a concern. So I'm loading up the float. I'm huffing and puffing. I'm out of breath. And I get home after about 2 hours of helping organize this float. And I get home and I take my shoe off, and my ankle is just huge. It's huge. I'm feeling lightheaded, a little panicky, which I've been feeling the days leading up to this. But again, I just, unless you've been pregnant before, you just don't know what's normal, and what's normal is different for everybody.
Right.
So I just really assumed that this was normal pregnancy things. So I texted my mom and I sent her a picture, not out of concern, more of like, oh my gosh, look at my...
Take a load of this.
Front foot. It's so big. It's like, this is crazy. And my mom said, she's had 4 kids. She was like, I don't know if that's really normal. And I was like, really? I think I'm just pregnant. I think that this is normal. And I ended up messaging a friend. I posted on Instagram that I was helping load up this float. And I got a lot of messages from people saying, are you riding? Are you riding? Because most people, I was very open about my pregnancy on social media. So people knew I was very, very pregnant. And so a lot of people messaged me asking if I was riding. And I was like, no, I'm just helping load up the float, just helping some friends. Like, I want to be a part of the energy if I can't be in the parade. So I thought it would be fun. And I sent one of my, I would say she's an acquaintance. We're friendly. We worked out a lot together. But she also happens to be a labor and delivery nurse. And so I sent her a picture of my swollen ankle. And she had responded and said, not to scare you, but have you checked your blood pressure recently? And I was like, what does that have to do with any of this? No, I hadn't checked it in over a month at that point, because like I said, I've always been healthy. I've never had blood pressure issues in the past. I've always had very stable labs and blood pressure, and I've had normal cholesterol and all of these things. I've never been an unhealthy person, so to speak, that it just didn't seem like a priority, especially because it wasn't explained to me why it needed to be a priority. So I ended up taking my blood pressure, and my blood pressure was 166 over 101.
That's high.
Yeah, which is high.
Yeah.
But, to me, I'm like, I don't know what this means. Again, I'm not in medicine. I was a history major. I'm not I'm married to medicine, but I'm not like a science girl by any means. And I was like, oh, that seems high. So I called my friend, and she was like, if I were you, I'd go to the OBED. And I was like, really? She said, yeah, I would go just to be, that's a high blood pressure. You just want precautionary measures. So being someone who's married to a resident, my husband was asleep. It was about 11 p.m. at this point. I knew he had to be up early the next morning for work. So I just went in there and said, hey, I'm going to drive myself to the hospital and go to the OBED.
You are awesome, by the way. You're a trooper. For all the residents out there, we applaud you for letting us sleep while you're going to the hospital with your high blood pressure and leaving us be. That is, wow.
Well, I'm, and again, your wife can
No, I hear you. You're listen, you know what it's like. That you're like this poor guy, like never sleeps. Like I'm it's legitimate, but it's a strange life.
It is a strange life. And just being married to medicine, you really have to be okay being independent and doing things on your own. And to be fair, I really didn't realize how big of a deal this was at the time.
Yep.
So in my opinion, we didn't live far from the hospital. I was like, I'm just going to drive there. I think it also helps that I worked for this hospital. So I felt comfortable with the organization as a whole. It wasn't scary to me. And just my husband worked there as a doctor, as a resident. So I'm like, this is not a scary experience for me. I'm just going to go in. They're going to probably monitor me and then send me home.
Right. You're an insider. Yeah.
Yeah. I felt like an insider. It didn't seem scary. So I just went into our bedroom and I was like, hey, you don't need to worry about it. I'm going to go. I'll call this problem or if I need anything. And just drove myself to the hospital. And I get there and they're all like, you came by yourself? I was like, yeah. I didn't even have like a hospital bag or anything, because this is how just uninformed I was about this being a big deal. They checked my blood pressure and they had determined that I was going to deliver that night. And in my head, I'm like, okay, I need to call my husband. I was not expecting any of this. Like, we don't have a crib set up. We don't have anything set up. And they're like, yeah, you're going to have to deliver. They ordered I feel like I'm going to say the name wrong, but it's labetalol.
Labetalol, perfect.
Yes, yeah. Labetalol.
Yeah, blood pressure medicine.
They ordered, it's I believe it's magnesium.
Yeah, magnesium, labetalol. You got it.
Yes. So they were ordering that, and then just kind of, I called my husband. He rushed over. What I didn't love about this experience was that because they were certain I was delivering, they had me sign all the consent forms without my husband there, which is fine. But between you and I couldn't tell you exactly what I signed.
Yeah.
It was really rushed.
It's pretty generic, I assume. It just says you're giving them consent to take care of you. I mean, everything in there is just legalese. They don't put it. There isn't anything that specific.
Okay. Well, there was just, I don't even remember signing the forms. I just know that at some point along this 30-minute ordeal, I had signed forms, consented to delivering. The anesthesiologist spoke to me, all of this kind of stuff. And then I just miraculously, my blood pressure dropped back down just on its own. They didn't give me the magnesium. They had ordered it, everything. They put an IV in me and they did not actually administer the medicine. So I stayed at the hospital for a few days, and on the 10th, so this was on the 8th, on the 10th, they let me go, went home, was getting ready to see my crew do their parade because we lived 2 blocks from the parade route. and had my, my makeup on and my beads on. And I knew that I wasn't in, the best shape, but because I was only 2 blocks from my house, I was like, I'll go down there, spend 10 minutes and then come back up if I'm feeling like it's too much or I just want to have a good time. So I'm trying to have a good time. And my blood pressure spikes back up to 174 over 109. Go back in there, go back to the hospital. They admit me again. My blood pressure is high, but it's not severe at this point. They send me back home the next day.
How many weeks are you at this time?
I am just 35 weeks at this point.
So what, I assume they gave you some sort of diagnosis. Did they say you had preeclampsia? Did they say you had gestational hypertension? Did they give you a specific diagnosis at that time? Like why your blood pressure is elevated?
Yes. And I should have mentioned this before, but on the 8th, they did a blood test and a urine test. And I had protein in my urine. My platelets were dropping pretty substantially.
Already on the 8th?
Already on the 8th, yes.
So they said you had preeclampsia.
They did say I have preeclampsia, and they said that they would deliver me at 37 weeks if I could make it to 37 weeks.
If you can make it that far, right.
Yes, but they didn't want to deliver me unless it was absolutely necessary.
Yeah, unless it got severe or something.
Yes. And so at this point, it was kind of teetering between severe and just preeclampsia. It was, really high, but then my body would kind of even it out and it would end up to be like 147 over, 100, which is still high, but it's not severe range at that point. So they're like, we're not going to deliver you. We're just going to monitor you. They also had given me a steroid shot so that my son's lungs could develop.
Right.
So I got that as well.
Right. Probably 2 steroid shots.
Yes. Right. It was, I think, 24 hours apart.
Correct.
Possibly.
You ultimately, it was just a few days later. What was it that made the decision to deliver? Because you were going back and forth. And at some point they said, we're delivering you. What was it that made them, that pushed it over the edge?
Yeah. So my blood pressure got up to 189 over 109 and wouldn't go back down. It was just continually to creep up. I think I got up into the 200s at one point.
And that was on the 12th, right?
That was on the 12th when I actually delivered. And my platelets kept dropping.
Okay.
And they were worried about having to do, I guess, and maybe you can speak to this, but I guess there was a concern that I would need to deliver and be like fully put under anesthetic because my platelets were too low and they didn't necessarily want to do that.
Right. If your platelets are low enough, platelets help your blood clot. So if your platelets are very, very low, the fear is that you're going to bleed a little bit more than somebody else, which is obviously a problem for surgery, but also it's a problem to get anesthesia in your back, like an epidural or spinal, because they're worried that if they put a needle in your back, you can be bleeding internally in your back near your spinal cord, which can paralyze you. So if there's a concern about bleeding, anesthesiologists typically would not feel it's safe to do a spinal epidural, so they have to put you to sleep. So that's the reasoning.
Gotcha.
That makes sense. Okay, so tell me about that day. So we're on the 12th, your blood pressure is really high, and they're like, all right, today's the day we're going to deliver the baby.
Yeah, so that day was pretty standard. We were going to go to a Mardi Gras parade again, because like I said, they happen every single day up until Fat Tuesday. And we live also 2 blocks from the parade route. So it's really easy for us to just walk down there, enjoy it in the manner that we want, and then go back into our home, which is nice. So we were getting ready again to go see a parade. And I just had this feeling, I don't know what it is about blood pressure, but anytime I had high blood pressure, I almost felt a little bit panicky, like I was having a panic attack. Mm-hmm. My heart rate was high. My head hurt. It just, I don't know how to explain it, but it's like you can feel that your blood pressure is high.
Okay.
So I took it, and that's when it was 189 over 109. And at this point, my husband had purchased a manual blood pressure cuff to double check, because I was thinking, maybe it's this electronic one that's just, I know I had high blood pressure in the hospital too, but I really didn't want to go back in just to be observed for another night to not deliver. So he manually checked it and he got an even higher number. And he was like, I think we need to go into the hospital. So after about an hour, I sat in the dark and I was like manifesting lowering my blood pressure. It doesn't really work like that though when it's preeclampsia.
Right.
So I went into the hospital. It was sustained high for, I guess, over an hour at that point. And they had asked me, do you want to, they said, you're for sure going to deliver tonight. And this is also Super Bowl Sunday, just an FYI, which is another piece of the story.
Right.
So I can hear like Rihanna in the background singing and all the nurses are in the nurses station watching the football game. And I'm like, this is great. This is exactly what I saw for myself. So they had said, you can either be induced or we can do a C-section. And, I was very satisfied with my care up till this point. This is where I have a little bit of a struggle because I felt like the risk, benefits, and alternatives of having a C-section were not well explained to me. And I think part of that is because I hadn't had that point in my pregnancy care where my doctor had gotten to sit down with me in like an organized fashion and explain what the options were or what that meant.
Right.
It was really, really quick, right? It was just that there's more of a risk with C-section, but we can do it. We feel comfortable doing it. But I didn't know what the risks were. It wasn't.
Right. Was it your doctor or was it a doctor you didn't know? So someone covering who was ever on at the hospital on that, I guess, Sunday. Okay.
And this is a teaching hospital. And, my husband's was a resident. I absolutely love residents, but I think it was explained to me maybe by an intern, which is a first-year resident.
Right.
So there was just, it's a teaching hospital. So there was a lot of different people talking to me with different, experience levels and years of experience. And so it just I didn't feel well informed. And looking back, I wish that I had asked more questions about this. But I had for an elective C-section is ultimately what had happened because they had said, you're going to deliver tonight. It's just in the manner of which you want to deliver, which, is your choice. And in my head, I'm thinking, well, I've been in and out of this hospital. I know C-sections are faster. Can I just deliver the baby so we can stop this song and dance?
Right.
That was my mentality.
Right.
But the C-section did not go according to plan. One, I was put on magnesium at that time because of the severe blood pressure. And so I'm throwing up the entire C-section for one, which is not a great experience. I had also eaten Taco Bell, so I wasn't.
So you're throwing up tacos.
Yes. Okay. Which is so embarrassing. It's not something I eat often, but pregnancy cravings. So
there's no shame. There's no shame here. You're pregnant. You got a free pass. You do whatever you want.
And I was like, this has been just in and out of the hospital, a poor experience. I just want my Baja Blast and quesadilla. And so there was no NPO, which, we didn't have time for me to digest my food. So I'm throwing up and my husband is next to me and he's scrubbed in and we get into the C-section. First, they have to move us to a different room because the lights in OR1 didn't work. So I had to be moved to OR2, which is just, it's just all the things are happening. All the small things that don't need to be happening are happening right now. And again, as Rihanna is performing on stage.
Right.
And I'm like, I want to be watching this. But so I get in there and my husband, I'm talking to him. I don't even know what I'm saying at this point. I have an epidural in, I'm throwing up. I don't even know what we're talking about.
Right.
And he's going, shh, stop talking. And I'm like, what? And he's like, this is taking too long. Something's wrong. And I'm thinking, okay, well, what is it? So my husband stands up.
Right. I mean, he's a surgeon.
Looks over, and he's a surgeon. So he looks over the sheet and the anesthesiologist is like, hey man, who my husband has worked with before. And he's also a resident. It's like, hey man, I need you to sit down because
sit
never doing that.
Yeah. Sit down, coach. All right.
And my husband's kind of starting to panic. I've never seen him in my whole pregnancy panic at all. Not even with the preeclampsia, nothing. And he's starting to panic. And so I start to get nervous.
This is the exact reason why you don't operate on family.
Yeah.
It's just you can't sort of be the way you need to be. Understandably, that's not a character flaw. That is human.
No, right, right. And that's the thing you have to remember about just everything with medicine is that all of these individuals are human. And so it's hard when you're married to medicine, you see both sides of it, right? And so it's a little hard. So essentially what happened was my son was head down like normal, but his head was floating and disengaged. So he was not, to my understanding, far enough down the birth canal in order to take him out.
Hard to easily get the head out of the incision if the head is sort of higher than the incision. That happens.
Yeah, so he was floating and disengaged. They had to cut through my abdominal muscle as well, which isn't super common, I don't believe.
To make the incision bigger, basically.
Yes, they had to make, exactly. They did 3 different tries with a Kiwi vacuum. They could not get him off. They all popped off. They ended up calling in, backup, which I don't know what backup assistance was going to help with necessarily, but they did have other people come into the OR. We're in the middle of the surgery.
Right.
And finally, what this surgeon ended up doing was flipping my son and pulling him out breech.
Feet first, Yeah.
And so when he was delivered, it had been 5 minutes, the delivery time, which I believe is pretty long. I mean, you would know. I believe that's pretty long to deliver for a baby to be without oxygen and to be delivered. Is that correct?
So they're not always without oxygen. It depends on the circumstances, meaning from making the incision on the uterus to delivering the baby, 5 minutes is definitely longer than typical for a C-section. It's usually within a minute, but it doesn't mean necessarily that during all those 5 minutes, the baby's without oxygen. It sort of depends on the circumstances. The baby could be perfectly fine, just floating around in there. So it really, again, each case is individualized. So I don't, I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why in your delivery the baby would have been without oxygen for 5 minutes. It's possible, but I don't know why that would have been just from struggling to get the head out.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good to know. And so he was delivered. He was floppy. He was his Apgar score was like a 1, which is obviously not great.
Yeah.
Purple, not breathing. He had a faint heart rate. So they did some breathing treatments on him. He had an NG tube and he ended up staying in the NICU for about a week.
And he was 35 weeks when he was born, right?
Yes.
30. So yeah, it's hard to know how much of that is related to the delivery versus just being a 35-weeker whose mom had preeclampsia and was on magnesium, because a week is sort of probably about average for, I'm guessing, I'm not a neonatologist, for a baby that's born 35 weeks is my guess. So who knows?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But he recovered though. After the 6 days, he went home,
So they just kept telling me he had a traumatic birth. He had a traumatic birth. I didn't know what that meant.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a very, it's a very colloquial term, traumatic birth, because, it sounded like it was difficult to get him out, which is, again, it can be traumatic emotionally, obviously, to you, to the doctors. It could be traumatic to the baby, like, again, based on the circumstances. But if the baby's just floating around, they're just trying to geometrically figure out how to get him out of there. It shouldn't be traumatic for him to wait 5 minutes to come out. And the low Apgar at 1 minute doesn't necessarily mean it was low oxygen, because sometimes premature babies have that. Sometimes it's just the fact that you're on magnesium. Who really knows? The 5 minute Apgar is a better sort of indicator of how he was doing. And if they send blood tests on the cord, there's things they can do, but yeah, I don't know.
Right.
We try not to say traumatic birth, because it doesn't, like, what does that mean? Like you said, you're like, I don't know what that means. And I don't know what that means. It could be it can be different thing to different people for good reason. It's quite vague what that means.
Right. And isn't every birth essentially traumatic? It's a big, physical burden for both baby and mom.
Right.
So,
depends how you view the word trauma. Yeah. Yes.
Exactly. Not even in the term of emotional trauma, but just anything your body goes through like that is in a way, I think would be considered trauma, just because it's an uncertain. I had abdominal surgery, that's traumatic.
Yeah, sure. It's a big deal.
So I don't, it was a little unclear to me. He had an NG tube, he had a CPAP machine, but overall he is doing really well.
Great.
Leaving the NICU was hard because We had to get to the hospital really early to be discharged so that we could get home before the floats started rolling for Mardi Gras. Again, the whole Mardi Gras element was just a disaster.
Right.
So the doctor had to meet us there really early to discharge. She had to come in early because otherwise we would have gotten caught behind hours of parade shenanigans.
So we got a 5 a.m. discharge for these guys. We got to get them out for traffic.
Yeah, it was super early. And we're just fighting against these floats. And we could see in the window of my son's hospital, of the NICU. And I'm saying, like, I see the floats loading up. We have to go now. Like, we got to hurry this up.
Wow. How long did it take for your blood pressure to come back to normal? Days, weeks, months?
Days. It was pretty immediate. I will say that I do feel as though I might have, my blood pressure seems higher than it normally. Like the baseline seems a little bit higher. I didn't used to have concerns of hypertension. And now I actually went to my primary care physician about 3 weeks ago just for my annual checkup. And my blood pressure was higher. So I don't know if that is a result of the preeclampsia, if, it can affect your baseline blood pressure postpartum, or if it's just lifestyle. I am a new mom, we're moved. I work full time, so it could also be stress related. But I did find that interesting that even though my severe blood pressure dropped almost immediately postpartum, but even still my baseline seems to be higher than my pre-pregnancy baseline.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of sort of research into that. And there's some evidence that having preeclampsia might like remodel your blood vessels in a way that makes them react differently later, meaning having the preeclampsia sort of affects your body later. And there's a lot of research that indicates it's not that, but in fact, it's having preeclampsia sort of unmasks something that was already there underlying. That people who get preeclampsia are people who are at risk for having high blood pressure afterwards. And it could be both. It could be a combination, but it's definitely, if someone has preeclampsia in pregnancy, it's more common that in their lifetime, they'll have hypertension for whatever reason. Doesn't mean they will get it. They just, their odds go up a little bit. So maybe, who knows? It's hard to say. Ultimately, we're unlikely to figure it out in the near future, but it's something that, you get watched for. And ultimately, as long as you're watched for it, typically, you'd be okay. Either you need medicine or you don't at some point in your life.
Yeah. And, it also could just be lifestyle related, but I always do wonder. I had COVID and the flu during my pregnancy as well. And
maybe,
I've looked up some research, PubMed, whatever, to see if there's research on that. And it seems that there has been some research going on, but it's really inconclusive at this time.
I would agree with that. There's some things indicate it might increase your risk of preeclampsia, but the vast majority of people got COVID in pregnancy did not get preeclampsia. So it's hard to know for sure. It's possible, I would say, that they're related. Looking back on all this, you're coming up on a year. What is it you want our listeners to take away from your story?
Yeah. So I think that something that it was really kind of eye-opening to me is that, pregnancy really can affect your baseline health. And I don't mean baseline as in when you're not pregnant. I mean, things that you've never experienced before, you can experience in pregnancy, even if you have absolutely no history of it. I never had a history of high blood pressure. I've always been very fortunate to have really good health. I've never been concerned about my health. I've never been hospitalized. And it shocked me that all of a sudden I was in this predicament where I was, preeclamptic. If it wasn't taken care of, could get much worse. And for someone who's never experienced any kind of health concerns, this was just eye-opening. So I think it's a matter of, even if you think something cannot happen to you, or you walk into your pregnancy feeling very healthy and being very fortunate with what you have and never having concerns, does not mean that you cannot, ignore that these could be possibilities. I know that there has been a lot of conversation recently just in preeclampsia in general. I don't know if you saw, but that Olympic athlete had recently passed from preeclampsia about a year ago. She was pregnant. And I mean, I think that is really telling that somebody who's in the kind of shape and health of an Olympic athlete can still get something serious like preeclampsia and, potentially have fatal results from that. And so I just want people to not think that they are immune to any kind of, health issues that could arise in pregnancy, and is to be an advocate for yourself and prioritize your health, even if it seems unlikely to happen to you.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Terrific.
Ooh.
Stephanie, thank you so much for volunteering to tell your story. Thanks for listening, first of all, which is great.
Of course.
Appreciate it. Love it. Thank you for volunteering. It's a great story. Yeah, there's a lot of lessons there. Preeclampsia is no joke. Most people go through it and they do fine and they recover, obviously, so we don't try to scare the hell out of people, but it needs to be taken very seriously. As you said, it's a real condition that, if not taken seriously, can go horribly wrong, unfortunately. And that's a really important lesson. And I'm glad it ultimately did work out for you. I'm glad Gus is doing well. And thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I feel like I got to spend an hour chatting with a celebrity today. So I appreciate your time, and this is a great experience, and I'm really glad I got to share my story. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to the Healthful Woman podcast. To learn more about our podcast, please visit our website at www.healthfulwoman.com. That's HEALTHFULWOMAN.com. If you have any questions about this podcast or any other topic you would like us to address, please feel free to email us at hw@healthfulwoman.com. Have a great day. The information discussed in Healthful Woman is intended for educational uses only and does not replace medical care from your physician. Healthful Woman is meant to expand your knowledge of women's health and does not replace ongoing care from your regular physician or gynecologist. We encourage you to speak with your doctor about specific diagnoses and treatment options for an effective treatment plan.